Welcome everybody to the final video in the little mini series that I'm doing on various levels of puzzles. So far we've done intermediate level puzzles, advanced puzzles, and in the last video I tried my hand at some master level puzzles. But all throughout I've been getting a lot of requests from people on my stream and in the comments to do a series of studies catered toward beginners, beginner level studies, and really talk about where to even start. If you're new to chess, I think a lot of people who are new to chess tend to get overwhelmed in their first solving exercises and don't know where to start. And I've listened, and I'd like to do a video where I solve a series of beginner level exercises, and obviously I'll walk through the solutions as usual, and I'll offer some broad level tips. So if you're new to chess, if you've only just learned the rules and you're just starting to solve exercises, then this video is for you. And if you're more advanced, then you absolutely can still listen and hopefully extract beneficial lessons from this video as well. So I've set the range to be 200 to 1,000, roughly speaking, you know, the beginner range. So we're going to get some varying difficulty, but hopefully we'll get some good exercises. Let's jump in. Okay, so first exercise, we have a middle game, and whenever I solve exercises, there is a sort of sequence of things that I tend to do. The first thing I almost always tend to do is count the material. So you look at the position, and in order to get your bearings, you need to figure out if either side is up, you know, a certain amount of material. What does that tell you? Well, if you've counted up the material and you figure out that you are down a queen, that tells you a lot about the solving condition of the exercise, because the condition of success cannot be to win back a minor piece, right? You're still going to be down a queen for a minor piece. You almost know for certain that it has to be something like checkmate. If material is equal, then, for example, winning a rook or winning a piece could absolutely be the solution, because that's a very hefty amount of material, right? So if we count the material here, both sides have 4 minor pieces. We have our rooks and our queens. And in terms of the pawn count, black is up 1 pawn, which is really not a big deal. You can kind of ignore differences like that in these types of puzzles. That doesn't really change anything unless it's an endgame. And the second thing that I try to do is kind of get a broad understanding of what's going on. You check the respective king safeties. You look at whether the center is open or closed, and you look immediately for vulnerabilities in black's position, your opponent's position. Now, what do I see here? I kind of see that black's king is still in the center. Right? That's a pretty big red flag because we're castled and black is not. The other big red flag is that black's king side is essentially undeveloped. Black hasn't gotten the bishop out. The rooks are still on their initial squares, whereas white is castled, and look at how all of white's pieces are kind of amassed in the center. So that kind of tells me that something is going on in the center. Now, what specifically? Well, what else do I see? One of the first things I look for in almost any position is also the placement of my opponent's queen. The queen is obviously a magnet for all sorts of tactics. Attacking the queen is a big deal because you're essentially forced to respond to that. And so combining the observation about black's king being unsafe, the center being open, and black's queen being right up in the center and quite vulnerable, you can start looking for ways to attack black's queen. Okay, so maybe you see the move bishop f4, but that square is unprotected, so the queen will just capture the bishop. Well, can we do anything with this knight? We absolutely can. We can go knight to b5, attacking the queen. Now, is that a good thing? Does that help? Well, let's try to calculate. Well, what's going to happen after knight b5? The queen's going to move. Where can the queen move? It can't go here. It can't go there. Can't go to e5. Can't go to f4. Why am I highlighting those squares in particular? Because those are the only squares from where the queen continues to defend the c7 pawn. It turns out that after knight b5, the queen has to move away from c7. Then we capture the pawn on c7. And why is that a big deal? Well, you're probably familiar with the concept of a fork. That knight, once it lands on c7, delivers a fork to the rook and the king, and we win at the very least a rook. Knight b5. Okay, queen b4. We take, and we take the rook, and the problem is solved. Okay. All right. Next exercise. Okay, so here the material count is pretty interesting. White has 4 pawns, black has 3. White has 2 rooks, and black has a queen, and that is approximately equivalent. That is a material imbalance, but it's kind of like a 50-50 situation. Really depends on the position. Now let's understand the king safety. Both kings are very clearly wide open, right? Black's king is confined to the side of the board. It's cut off by the rook. So one thing that you can immediately spot is that white threatens to swing the other rook over to a8 with a ladder mate, right? The one rook is cutting off the king, the other rook is doing the checking. What does that tell us? That kind of tells us that we have to start looking for checks. We have to make a forcing move, because if we don't, because you're solving an exercise, and this is not really cheating, but you've got to understand that in order to solve the exercise, you're going to have to win. So just very passively defending against a threat is rarely going to do the job. So a move like queen c6, right, which would defend the a8 square, it would defend against the immediate mate threat, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually further the cause of trying to win the game. So that's why I immediately start looking for checks. The only piece that can deliver a check is the queen. Okay, queen c2 looks tempting, but there's a rook on b2 that's guarding that square. The queen also moves diagonally, so it can swing all the way back to g1. And wait a second, you might notice that the white king is unable to escape to c2 because there's a pawn controlling that square, and there is a rook that is blocking the king from going out to b2. So queen g1 is simply mate in one, right? Maybe you saw that immediately, but I was trying to spell that out so that if you didn't see it immediately, hopefully I explained the way that you can kind of stumble onto this type of move. Okay, the next position here, material is equal. Both sides have a pair of rooks, a queen, and a bishop, and the pawn count is equal. So looking at the position broadly, what do I see immediately? Well, I see that the d file is open, and there's a lot of pieces there. Whenever there's a lot of rooks on a file, you kind of know for a fact that stuff is going to go down on that file. And in particular, what square seems to be the center of the tension? Well, it's the d4 square, right? Because black has a rook there. White is attacking that square 2 times, and black is defending it 2 times as well. So if a square or a piece is defended the same number of times that it's attacked, then taking that piece, at the very best, will result in a mass trade. So for example, if you take on d4, then the queen takes on d4, you trade queens, and then black takes with the rook, and we haven't really accomplished anything. But when there is a large number of pieces that is defending another piece, that raises the possibility of an interference tactic. And an interference tactic is when you literally put a piece between 2 of your opponent's pieces with the aim of severing their coordination. And preferably, the piece that you put in between the 2 pieces could also be threatening one of the pieces. So that way, you're essentially overwhelming your opponent's defenses. Now, that was maybe a little bit confusing, but try to apply that here. Can you put something between the 2 rooks? You could play bishop d5, right? And that would be a pretty smart move, because if black captures the bishop, then we can capture black's rook. But what's the problem with bishop d5? Pause the video, try to figure that out. So the point is that black can take white's rook after bishop d5. Bishop d5 itself does not create enough of a threat. So black can take the rook, we have to take back, and then black simply takes the bishop with a pawn. But what about black's queen? The queen is not a great defender because it's very easy to attack. There's not a lot of distance between the queen and the rook, but if you look carefully, you will see that you can push that pawn out to e5. We can play pawn e5. That attacks the queen. So that's the main difference between bishop d5 and e5. e5 carries a threat. So if black takes the rook on d1, we don't have to recapture. We simply take black's queen with check. Even if it wasn't check, by the way, that would still be perfectly good enough. Okay, so after e5, what happens if the queen just drops back? Well, then the queen no longer defends the d4 rook, and it's got 2 attackers and 1 defender. We win the rook. Now, black has 1 more attempt after e5, and that is queen f4, which they play. But now you have to see the bigger picture here, which is that while taking on d4 no longer makes sense because the queen still defends the rook, this rook is overloaded. First of all, it's standing behind white's rook on d1 and the rook on d8, which is undefended. And it's also attacking or defending the queen. So what we simply need to do is take the queen. The rook takes the queen, and now we slide on over and take the rook on d8. And one other important thing to notice is that once we go e5 and the queen moves, that rook on d8 essentially is undefended. If we could get this rook off of d4, we would be able to take black's other rook. Okay, so this is a classic interference tactic, and the way to spot it is to identify pressure points in the position. Which squares are the ones where there's a lot going on, and those are the squares that you can try to gear your tactics around, if that makes sense. Okay, next problem. All right, so here again, material seems to be equal. Knight, knight, bishop, bishop, 2 rooks, and queen. King safety, well, it doesn't seem to indicate too much. I would say black's king is a little bit more vulnerable because black doesn't have a pawn on the g file. But on the flip side, black's rook is x-raying white's king. So black might be threatening to fianchetto the bishop, attack the queen, and if the queen moves, that g2 pawn might fall. So that tells me we have to do something pretty urgently. Right, so what else do I notice? Is the center open or closed? Well, the center is wide open. There are barely any pawns in the center. And that means that there is likely to be contact between pieces. Anytime there is contact between two heavy pieces, such as a queen and a rook, or a queen and another queen, or a rook and a bishop, you have to examine that contact and see if you can't revolve your tactic around it. So I'm seeing that the queen is hitting the rook on a8. And if you've been watching my stream or my other videos, you might be familiar with the terminology I've developed of type 1 and type 2 undefended pieces. But let me recap that for those of you who are new to my channel. A type 1 undefended piece is a piece that is not protected by any other pieces. Now, black, other than the queen, and I consider the queen to always be undefended, all right? Because even if you defend a queen with a bishop and a rook and a pawn, and the queen is attacked by a knight, because the queen is the most valuable piece, it still has to move, right? Okay, so the queen is always undefended. A type 1 undefended piece is the knight on d4. It's not protected by any other pieces. Those are the most vulnerable pieces. People are aware of that. What people often forget to check are type 2 undefended pieces, and that is a piece which is only protected by one other piece and not a pawn. Okay, the rook on b1 is a type 2 undefended piece. The rook on a8 is a type 2 undefended piece because it's only protected by the knight. And the moment that I tell you that, you should immediately spot the solution, because you can see that your two rooks are aimed at black's knight. You can simply take that knight and remove the defender of the a8 rook. After black takes the rook and we take black's rook, we are up a knight because we took a knight at the start and black didn't. Boom, boom. The most important thing here is to identify type 2 undefended pieces, because oftentimes a tactic like this exists. You either take the piece, or if we had a pawn on a4, we could play a move like a5, chasing the knight away, and then black will have to choose between giving up the knight and giving up the rook. All right, next position. Okay, so here black is down a piece because white has a knight and black doesn't. But what else do I notice? Don't get overwhelmed when there's a lot going on. Just try to sort of, what you can do is you can break up the, I don't love doing this, but one thing you can do is, if you're a little bit overwhelmed, is to break the position up into its 3 component sides, right? The queen side, the center, and the king side. So let me see if I can draw them in different colors. Very good. So these are the 3 parts of the board. And in general, I always tell my students to look at the whole board. Try not to overly disattach each side of the board, because you can forget that one piece on the king side can be aiming at something on the queen side. But it can be a helpful way to make observations. So what's going on the green part of the board? Well, not much, right? There's a couple of pawns there. White is attacking our pawn on c6, but clearly that's not the most important thing. What's going on the 2 center files? Well, here I see something pretty important. I'm seeing that the black rook is x-raying white's bishop. In fact, it's pinning white's bishop. My apologies. That means that the bishop cannot move without losing the queen. Okay, what do I see on the king side? Well, I see another x-ray type situation. Look at this pawn on g2. Does black just have checkmate in 1? Well, no. If you look carefully, you'll see that white's queen defends g2. But white's queen also defends the bishop. And the bishop is a type 2 undefended piece, to use our new terminology. It's only defended by the queen. So hypothetically, if we could distract the queen from the second rank, well, then we would have checkmate, and we have just the way to do that. We take on d3. Okay, queen takes d3 is not the best move, clearly, but that's the move that they play. What should white do here? White should move the queen aside, but then black has recovered the extra piece and has an overwhelming attack. So for ease of solving, they take the rook and we take on g2. This is a classic overloading situation. Okay, next position. This is very instructive. Now, count the material patiently. Material is equal. And you should notice something very interesting here, which is that both queens are under fire. White is attacking black's queen. Black is attacking white's queen. And that is a situation in which you can essentially follow a formula to find the right tactic, if it exists. The first type of move that you should look for is whether you can move your queen away with check. Now think about why I'm recommending that, because if you move your queen away with check, presumably your opponent has to respond to that check, moving the king, for example, but then you can take your opponent's queen. So if the white queen could land on e6 here and check the black king, we would be in great shape. The king would have to move and we would win the queen. Unfortunately, that's not possible here. We don't seem to have any straightforward checks. So the second type of move that you should look for is what's called a Desperado Sacrifice. And the word Desperado Essentially just means if you've decided that you're already losing one of your pieces, you don't just want to give away that piece for nothing. You want to give away that piece for whatever you can get for it, right? You essentially go to the pawn shop, no pun intended, and you give away your piece for whatever you can get for it. So here's the logic. If we have determined to take black's queen, wouldn't it be nice if we can give away our queen for a piece, even for a pawn, if nothing else presents itself? Okay, so should we take black's pawn on f5? Well, no, because that move's not a check. And remember, our rook on d1 is the type 2 undefended piece, so black would simply take it. But what else can we get for the queen? Look around. Can we take anything? Well, yes, we can. We can take the bishop on g7, and that's also a check. And after king takes queen, we take black's queen, and we are up a bishop. We will have a bishop, and we've taken black's bishop, right? We take on g7. We take on d2. Sometimes both types of moves will exist. You'll have a check, and you'll have a Desperado Sacrifice. What you have to be very careful about is if the Desperado does not come with check. If the Desperado is not a check, your opponent can counter Desperado and, for example, can take something even more. If this move was not a check, black would have been able to take the rook. So it's very, very important that it is a check. Okay, next position. Well, this is a mate in 1. White is, for what it's worth, white is down a lot of material. But one thing that you have to notice in many types of positions is a battery. That is when a bishop and a queen are lined up on one diagonal, or a rook and a queen are lined up on one file. That is also a battery. And batteries allow you to infiltrate your opponent's territory. In this case, we spot the battery immediately. Where are they aiming? They're aiming at h7. Can we take that pawn? Well, is anything else defending it other than the king? Looking around. Nope, there's no knight on f6. There's no rook on h6. We can just take it. And that is just checkmate, right? That's just mate in 1. All right. Maybe we'll do a couple more. So white to play in this position. All right, so material seems to be equal. Oh, black is up a pawn. Let's compare king safety. So our king seems to be pretty safe. Black's king is right in the center. And it seems to be pretty wide open. Now, when you have identified your opponent's king as weak, all right, you have to understand immediately, well, what tools do you have at your disposal to attack your opponent's king? And there's a couple of tools that you can specifically look for. The first is you have to look at your rooks and see whether they're located on open files. A rook on an open file is a very dangerous thing. And an open file can be the avenue through which you infiltrate and actually exploit the weakness of your opponent's king. So this rook on a1 is on a closed file, but the rook on b1 is on an open file, right? The b file literally has nothing on it. All right, so what do we do with this open file? Well, you can move the rook to a place on that file and start the attack against black's king. So what move comes to mind? Well, what about rook b7 attacking the queen? Well, that's not a good idea because then the queen's just going to take the rook, right? And following the common advice of checks, captures, threats, if you follow that advice, you would start by looking at rook b8 check. Now, I want you to understand, if you're new to chess, that a check in and of itself doesn't mean that if it's a check, it doesn't mean it's automatically a good move. A move is not good because it's a check. But checks can often be a very useful way of forcing the king onto undesirable spots. So after rook b8 check, what options are available to black? Well, first of all, you have to check whether the check can be blocked. It can be blocked by the rook on d8. But because white has a queen on h4, which you noticed, of course, the queen could take that rook. And that doesn't help. So after rook b8, black has to move the king. Where can he move it? He can move it to d7 or f7, but not to e7, because the queen is controlling that square. Now, try to visualize in your head how the position changes after the king moves, let's say, to f7. Rook b8, king f7. But what you have to look for is alignment of heavy pieces. If the king and the queen are aligned, and I said that in a previous video, if they are aligned on the same rank, on the same file, on the same diagonal, it doesn't matter. Same with the king and rook. You have to look for skewers, checking the king, and the king has to move, and then you win the queen. And the skewer exists, rook b7 check. Now you can put the rook on the 7th rank. The king has to move, and then we win the queen. So what I want you to notice is that the result of this attack is not a checkmate. It's actually just a material win. And you'll often see that. I think as a beginner, as a new player, you might be tempted to think that every attack should end in checkmate, but that's not true. When you are attacking your opponent's king, when you're bringing your pieces into the game, you should always look for ways to exploit the weakness of your opponent's king, but not by giving checkmate, but rather by doing something like we do here, which is, let's say, to win and skewer and win a queen. Rook b7, rook takes g7, the game is over. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more. And interesting position here. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so Again, we have a lot going on, but let's not get overwhelmed. Material is equal. 6 pawns, 6 pawns. Opposite colored bishops for what it's worth. Now, where is the center of gravity in this position? Well, it seems to be the E file. How do I know that so quickly? Well, one piece of advice that I often share, even with higher rated players, is to pay particular situations to positions where there's only one open file. Because if there's only one open file and there's bound to be a lot of traffic on that file, control of that file is going to be very important. So I'm immediately looking at the E file. There's a lot going on here. And I'm also looking at the alignment between my bishop and black's queen. That is an x-ray. Who holds the power in that x-ray? Well, it's white. We had a puzzle like this in the previous video or the video before that, because what we can do is something called a discovered attack. A discovered attack is when you have an alignment between, let's say, a bishop and your opponent's queen, and you have a piece in the middle. That piece in the middle can be moved out of the way, and that's where the discovery comes from, essentially opening up an attack against that piece, right? So we can move the rook, and then black's queen is going to be under fire. Where can we move it? Well, we don't just want to move the rook anywhere, right? If we move the rook, let's say, back to e3. Well, is that a good move? No, it's not, right? Because the queen's just going to take the bishop. So the move that we make with the rook, preferably, either has to be a check, or it has to pose some independent threat, which your opponent has to respond to. Do we have a check? Well, we do. We can take black's rook. That's why we've got that open file. But if you look carefully, you'll see that it's not the end of the story because the line goes on. If we take black's rook on e8, black takes with his rook. Well, what's going on then? Then we have the same situation we had 2 exercises ago where both queens are hanging. So rook takes e8, rook takes e8. And if we take black's queen, black takes our queen, and material is equal. Okay, so let's remember what we have to look for in situations where both queens are hanging. First of all, we have to look for checks. Second of all, we have to look for desperado captures. Well, once again, we have a move that serves both of those. We can take black's rook with our queen. And when black takes with his bishop, we take black's queen, and we're going to be up a full rook. So rook takes c8, and this move should come very logically to you if you sort of paid careful attention to how I explored that puzzle with both queens hanging. We take the rook, and then we take black's queen. Boom, boom. And let's do one final exercise, and this one's an endgame exercise. Now we have a pawn endgame, where both sides have 2 pawns. The most important thing, and I'll definitely do videos sort of more specifically geared toward endgames, but for now what I'll say as a shorthand is that king activity is the most important thing in pawn endgames. And what does king activity mean exactly? Well, it means generally one short way of understanding it is how close your king is to your opponent's pawns. Because ultimately, you're not going to win this endgame unless you win at least one of white's pawns, right? Then it's just going to be a draw if you don't do that. Now, what devices do you have of winning white's pawns? You only can do that with a king. It's very hard to win a pawn with another pawn. So black's king should be aiming at white's pawns. There's only one pathway, and that is to play king b4. And the reason this is winning for black is because white's king is simply too far away from his own pawns. We stick the king on a3. We take the pawn, and the problem is solved. This still needs to be won. And you know, analyzing this endgame is a little bit outside the scope of this video. Once again, I'm planning to make a lot of endgame videos as well. But this is winning. Suffice it to say, we're up a pawn, and the win is pretty straightforward here. And that was 10 exercises. So obviously, if you're an experienced player, this should have been very basic. But if you're new to chess, I hope that you benefited from some of these pieces of advice. A couple of points to summarize. First thing is remember to count the material and always start by trying to get a bird's eye view of what's going on. Where is the tension happening? Are there open files? Compare the safety of the kings. And when you feel like you figured out, almost try to make a mental heat map of the position. And also look for things like alignment. Is your bishop staring at your opponent's queen through the lens of another piece? Is there only one open file and a bunch of rooks on it? Then you start looking for back range combinations. Are both queens hanging? You start looking for desperado combinations. So essentially you build this mental library of what to look for given certain mental cues. And eventually all of that's going to go into your muscle memory. You won't actually need to remind yourself to check these things. Your brain will automatically do it. That's a very exciting progression. If you keep solving exercises, you keep figuring out why you went wrong, where you went wrong, and how you could have gotten the problem right, I guarantee you're going to improve and you're going to reach that point of automatization. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoyed the puzzle solving series. I'll see you very soon in the next video. Thank you very much for listening. See you soon.